Hi, and welcome to the Hearth Matters podcast. Our guest today is Stephen Shaw. He's a data scientist and the filmmaker behind Birthgap, a documentary about declining birth rates and unplanned childlessness, which are two global phenomena that you'll hear about today. I'll keep this introduction brief by saying two quick things. First, as you'll hear, Birthgap is very much a part of the Hearth Matters origin story, and that is why we are so excited to be in conversation with Stephen Shaw and to share this episode with you. Second, and I won't spoil the show or the documentary too much, but I will recommend Birthgap to any young person, man or woman, who isn't thinking much about if or when they'll have kids. No matter what you think about the now mainstream issue of falling birth rates worldwide, this documentary portrays the grief and the regret of people who want children, but who never have them because the circumstances just don't work out. In sum, time is short, the stakes are high, and fertility is a precious thing. So listen to this episode and then find Birthgap on YouTube. We'll link it in our show notes below. Enjoy. Stephen Shaw, welcome. This is truly a full circle moment for me and Catherine because we met via a documentary feedback discussion that you hosted in March of 2023. And the group ended up being around 15 people who were joining in from all over the world. And what you did was give us an opportunity to introduce ourselves and explain what sparked our interest in the film. And I remember Catherine asked something like, who's working on solutions? And she got to talking about the economic vulnerability of women when they leave the workforce to focus on having babies. So I thought immediately, this is someone I need to meet and help. And 1 year later, we've lifted off a nonprofit and we're back together with you on our podcast. So it is such an honor. Thank you so much for making the time.
Well, it's such a heartwarming story for me to hear that you met on that, that feedback forum group that we held. It's one of those chilling moments that makes me realize that sometimes things are meant to be, I guess. I remember when I hosted that call, I was actually sitting in Doha waiting, I think, maybe hours after that, I took part in something called Doha Debates, something that's never actually aired yet for some strange reason. So that was just over a year ago. And I ended up debating against a woman from a population organization who's basically an antinatalist. And the audience, live audience, was maybe 100 young people from around the world. And the stories they were being told by this antinatalist that you can have a kid anytime you want, you focus on your careers, enjoy your life. And to see that chilling message being told, lies being told to young people, trying to dismiss everything I would say, and clearly some people believing her that was right, and then hearing, that when I was there in Doha, maybe that was the real kind of aha moment for me, that I was supposed to be there to host that call to meet people like you, who I think have a very different viewpoint. And I know your story, Erin, that you've just become a mother, which is, it's the perfect story from my point of view. This is the real story that we're going to, I think, have in this podcast. So sorry for the long response to your introduction, but it's also a great moment for me to reconnect with you both.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's what set me kind of on fire, is realizing that no, in fact, we can't have babies when and how we want them. They don't just kind of come out of nowhere, and there takes a lot of planning and resources, and it's that's what your work is all about. So we're really excited to get into it. But I wanted to first start with your professional background, which is not in demography or in, birth gap declines. So tell us a little bit about what led you to want to film a documentary about falling birth rates, and why this subject mattered, why it felt important to you that you wanted to shed a light on it.
This is both my favorite question and my least favorite question at the same time, because it's hard to explain, but I do want to explain it. My professional background for more than 20 years, I've run a data science company, working with many professors. We employed many PhDs. We worked, the life of the company coincided with really the birth of data science. And that meant that over those decades, I got to work alongside some people coming up with the most fascinating, interesting data models as to how to predict the future or how to understand the world around us. And it's true that I did not specifically study demography, but demography was always part of that. You were always figuring out things about people and where they lived and what their buying patterns might be or what their preferences might be. So people were always a really important component in all the analytics that we did and still do. The moment I saw that the birth rate decline trend was a feature in almost every industrialized country, and that it had been set in place in the 1970s, I mean, literally, I froze. I mean, if you were to be told there's a giant meteor about to hit Earth in the next 20 years and it's not looking good, I think you'd freeze. That's the same sensation I got. This is, civilization ending. It doesn't happen in an instant, and you don't get to kind of see the meteor through telescopes. It just eats a society from within. So it's hard to explain, but it wasn't a case of taking a few days, weeks, or months and thinking maybe I'll write a book or do a documentary. It was instantaneous. It was literally, in the headlights. That moment changed my life. And it so happened that the skills that I had fostered, both fostered and being taught, were the exact same skills that I felt were much needed here to help understand this crisis using data science, data analytics techniques. And that's what happened. And from that moment to this moment, I really have put at least 90% of my waking hours into this and nothing else, as my family and friends well know. It's just captivated me in my life. And I'm certainly not complaining about it. It's also given me a lot of heartening moments like the one we just had here when I hear it, that the research in some ways is positively affecting people's lives.
Yeah, your documentary has been so helpful in our work because, we realized early on that women around us weren't having children. Aaron and I both have pretty much run in liberal circles our entire life. Liberals especially aren't reproducing. I have a background in hospitality and then also I'm a food company founder, and I've always been interested in the hearth, all the activities around the hearth, and I saw the economic and cultural blocks there for women to stay home and take care of their children. Really frustrated with, the agendas about getting women back to work as soon as possible and getting our kids into daycare instead of, wait a minute, how do we help our moms stay at home for as long as possible with our kids? So that's where my mind was when I heard about your work and then met Aaron on this Zoom call. In a little over a year, your documentary has gone from being really controversial, which always shocked me. You were canceled at Cambridge, called all kinds of terrible names for simply calling out a problem. And I guess my question is, did you expect the film to be so controversial? And how does it feel to now see the acceptance of your documentary pretty much and this idea and this conversation? You brought a conversation alive. It's everywhere in mainstream media now. Talk to us a little bit about this experience for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. Did I expect this? The answer is yes, but I didn't quite expect it to be in the form. I didn't expect that women would, from some angles, be angry with me or with the movie itself. The whatever nth wave feminists who cancelled me at Cambridge, for example. I really didn't see that. I thought it is a pro-women film because it's not coercive in any way. In fact, I show 5 women who had never wanted children, who are today in their 40s, 50s, 60s, quite happy with their lives. I did feel that the ideologists in the environmental movements, the likes of Paul Ehrlich and his current followers, I think that's the right term, would be disturbed that I was upsetting their narrative that they have successfully been able to push through media channels, education channels for decades now. I knew they would feel very uncomfortable that someone else was revealing the truth about what they were saying. And back to Doha debates, that's exactly what happened. The person I dated, debated, she openly denied that unplanned childlessness existed, that there were women, until the moderator intervened to force her to accept that there must be some women, and reluctantly she did. Those were the people I knew would upset, but they were the right people to upset. I'm very, very, very happy that those people are upset. So I think I can say the extreme feminists who deny motherhood has any value, who push an agenda where it doesn't really matter if a woman has a child or not. If you don't, so what? Those are the people who were loudest and did surprise me. But, I'll take their criticism simply because whenever the screening at Cambridge University was cancelled last spring, 150 people were excluded from being able to enjoy the film. The documentary itself, in the 2-3 weeks after that, got a boost of 100,000 people watching it over and above what it would have been. So I guess they actually helped. And it's very nice to see. Recently, I was interviewed twice for the BBC, once for the equivalent to the BBC in Japan, NHK1. They did a mainstream primetime documentary about the making of Birthgap. So, and yes, I think, in the past few days, I've seen a couple of stories where people have referenced the fact that the problem is not mothers having fewer children, but fewer women becoming mothers. And when I see that, I am, it's heartwarming that I played some role in informing people that that's what the reality is and continues to be. But it's good that people are talking about it.
Yeah.
So it's not that women are having fewer children, but that fewer women are becoming mothers. So
it's not that mothers are having fewer children.
Right.
You say women, you're talking about an average woman. Well, of course, there's no such thing as an average woman. And that has really been the problem in the media when we talk about TFR, total fertility rate, puts all women as if all women are the same. Women are not the same. Some choose to have children, some don't. Some end up not having children that they wanted to have. Some women want children younger, some older. So the idea that we're averaging women out is part of the problem. So I just to be clear, I want to state that it's not that mothers are having fewer children. They're not. They're having the same number of children or even a little bit more than in the 1980s. It's that fewer women are becoming mothers.
Perfect. I'm glad you clarified, because that's exactly where I wanted to go with the question, which is just, how do we determine that birth rates are falling, and what are the factors that are contributing to birth rate decline? It's a tongue twister.
So going back to the middle of the last century, a number of demographers came up with this way to measure fertility levels, the number of children societies were having. And because some countries are clearly bigger than others, stating the number of births isn't particularly useful. What they came up with was this way of coming up with the concept of the average woman in a country, and then looking at, on average terms, how many children on average they were having. So lots of averages in there. And it actually was useful for a time when you have very low levels of childlessness. That average equates pretty much with the average family size, because almost all women were becoming mothers, so it served a purpose. And you could argue today in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, low childlessness levels, it's giving us some real sense of family size, and that might be useful. I wasn't satisfied with that at all. In data science, you try to avoid averages at all costs, because averages hide the real story. Almost universally, by going to a more granular level of data, you learn something that you would not have known by focusing on averages. So what I did for the first time was separate out those women who became a mother. By definition, if you've had at least your first child, you're a mother. So I was able to kind of delineate that and look at this statistic from the perspective of the average number of children per mother.
Mm.
And you could go deeper than that, and I did. But just the most powerful thing and most simple thing is to look at what are mothers doing, or what have they been doing in recent decades? And then, having defined the proportion of women that become mothers, you're able to look at the flip side of that, those women who never become mothers, and that becomes a childlessness rate. So instead of just taking this overall average, which has not served us well in recent times, demographers still haven't been able to explain birth rate decline using this average TFR number. They still can't agree on many aspects of that. For example, demographers are still heavily debating why we have a fertility gap. So if you take women on average are having fewer children than they desire. And this is head scratching. But for me, once you split it into looking at mothers, actually, no, mothers are having the exact same number of children as they desire on average. There's no fertility gap at all once you become a mother on average, there or thereabouts. The actual issue is all to do with childlessness. If I could just go on to say one important thing, having split the data into these two sets, you find this great stability in motherhood over decades through changes in government, through financial crises, through in different countries, different different contexts. Mothers are resilient. And this is incredible. You don't normally see this in other data sets where through good times and bad times, mothers have been having. So in the US, mothers back in 1985 were having 2.4 children. Today, it's actually gone up to 2.6. In Japan, 50 years ago, mothers were having 2.2 children. Today, it's exactly the same. In the UK, in the 1970s, it was 2.3. Today, it's exactly the same.
Wow.
So resilience here, motherhood is phenomenal. And it's a worthy, study in its own right. But what happened going back to those early days, back to the early 70s, childlessness was somewhere around 5 to 10% in those countries. I'll not list them all, but it was low. And with a few short years in the 70s, exploded in Japan up to over 30%, Italy to over 30%, UK as well. US went up to around 17, 20% within 2 to 3 years, within an incredibly short period of time. And you don't see that in other data sets where there's suddenly such an immediate transformation. And you then look at what was going on in those early 70s, and there's huge financial crises in the world related to what's called the Nixon shock, but then more particularly the oil shock of 73. And you see what happened. Those moments in time, women who had not yet become mothers started delaying parenting. It became more normal to have a child later. And as people delay parenthood, it's very obvious in the data, the likelihood of you ever becoming a mother goes down, partly due to biology, but partly due to other factors. It gets harder to find a partner as time goes on. So it's a long answer, but only when you categorize women into mothers and not yet mothers or non-mothers, only then do you start to get a real sense of what's truly been happening.
Were there other factors beyond economics that you think were happening in the 70s that correlate to that dramatic decrease?
It's so clear that it's really driven by the financial side. The exception might be in Germany. Germany's birth rate actually fell earlier than other nations in the late 60s. And at that time, there were student riots going on. So it wasn't so much economic there. It seems to have been huge political turmoil. And in South Korea, it was a mix of both currency issues going on at a time when the country was having other issues as well. It does seem to be that the biggest force are financial concerns. So the clearest example I have is the the global mortgage shock of 07, 08. Overnight, multiple countries, including the US. So the US childlessness rate went up to around 20% from 71. You get to 07, 08, and again, there's this huge spike that just triggers off from 08 to 09. And it's exact same in Ireland and the Netherlands and Malaysia and Costa Rica. So it really is very clear. There are enough instances now to start to statistically get comfortable making statements that there's a causal link with financial crises.
Are we seeing data coming out of the COVID pandemic? I think you could probably categorize that as a financial crisis as well, or maybe not even financial crisis as much as a crisis of people not meeting. Like, how long does it take for us to see a trend emerge, or a blip, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm still not comfortable yet making any assessment on that. I don't feel there's enough data. What we're looking at, and there does seem to be a mix of what was going on, which means either it had no consistent effect or delayed effect, and also looking at different policies in different countries. I think this will make a great research project, probably about 3 to 5 years from now. I think at that point, we will know if the blip has come back down or if it was in fact a trigger of a bigger trend, and to also look at the policies of individual countries.
Got it. Got it.
To what extent have the increased longevity, how is that correlated in this discussion in any way?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, but first of all, to say it's actually not correlated at all, because the increase in longevity has been, universal across the industrialized world and beyond. Yet you look at the triggering of the fall in birth rates, and that happened at different times in different countries. So you start to see disconnects there, and that, we can use this approach to dismiss a lot of things. For example, people wonder about, fertility health, particularly male fertility health, has declined. Is that a factor? And well, I guess it could be, but it wasn't the original trigger of this, because you have to go back to the early 70s and find something that uniquely happened in Italy, Japan, UK, and certain countries, but did not happen in France or the US, for example. So we can use this approach to mapping when these things started to eliminate some things. Now, it may well be that if birth rates start to recover, we'll hit new ceilings and male fertility health, maybe a new ceiling that we don't know about yet, but it doesn't explain the current trends.
So when we're talking about the metrics that you use for determining birth rates, what age are you looking at?
So the traditional way to define birth rates are from when girls are 15 up until 49. It's kind of a universal standard. And I follow that pattern too. Reality is that, relatively speaking, very few children are born after 40, 45. I would be able to do a complete analysis and get the same answers by looking at actually births for when aged up to 35. That's when the vast majority of births are still taking place.
And so the replacement rate, though, who are they replacing? Or do they have to be entering into the world by the time somebody's retiring? What is?
Yeah, thank you for that. No, it actually doesn't matter at all. If you were someone who, I guess it might have happened, at age 49, you had twins as a woman, and they survive, then you've replaced you and your partner. So it could happen at any moment in time. However, that does actually have an impact on the total population headcount of Earth, because the earlier that people are having children, the more generations will be alive at the same time, and the total head would kind of scale up or scale down. That's not exponential growth. It's not like we need to worry about world's population going out of control because people might start having children younger in future. But it does have an adjustment factor in terms of the total headcount.
Got it.
Got it. And what percentage of the birth gap can be explained by unplanned childlessness versus just people not wanting to have kids because they see motherhood is a tough go and they just are opting out? Like, have we seen an increase in the percentage of people who just don't want kids?
How long do we have in this podcast?
Long as we want.
This really goes to the crux of a lot of my own work. And I have to say, it's a good question, but I need to refine it a little bit first. What we see in the data is a U-shaped curve wherein women, girls in their teenage years, really don't have quite as much desire for children until they get into a fertility window. And then desire goes up, and then into 30s, certainly by mid 35, mid 30s, 35 onwards, things flatten out a little bit again. So you see an intense period, a more intense desire to have children if someone hasn't had a child by 30, 32, for example. So you have to look at, when this time is. Now, I think we have seen in social media and in some surveys an overall decline in stated intention to have children, but quite a lot of it is related to this. Is perhaps teenagers, perhaps watching TikTok, thinking, why would I ever want to have a child? But once that they meet that partner or get to that age, I believe that can still change very quickly. At least I haven't seen any evidence against that. Now, from my own research going into, detailed fertility records for now 27 countries, there's certain universalities here that actually can help answer your question very clearly. I believe that the vast majority of the birth gap is explained by unplanned childlessness. That the trends we see, the shifts towards increases in childlessness happen so fast, whereas what we typically see with trends happen over a decade, 2 decades. They might happen more in urban areas than, non-urban areas. Yeah. None of those things are emerging in the data at all. It really looks like societal delays to parenthood are causing people to run out of time. And my current work is very much focused on this topic. And the findings, I have to tell you, I can't really discuss them completely, was they're not fully complete yet. But what I'm seeing right now, I found quite scary, because it really looks like if you miss the boat, you miss the boat. And it's quite chilling way. So what I will share is this. I need to share something with you. You would expect to see some kind of evidence of delayed parenthood where people successfully have children through like some uplift in maybe late 30s pregnancies. You would expect to see some evidence, and there's absolutely none in any country I've looked at. It's implying that, almost the more and more we do to bring out the greatest fertility technology, while that works for some, the overall impact of those technologies is to persuade younger women to delay birth further. So while there is increasing percentage of women who have IVF clearly and have kids, but at a societal level, it does not improve the likelihood of a woman to have a child at some moment in her lifetime. And those universal things really support, the hypothesis that this is unplanned childlessness. So, all the data markers, without exception, are pointing that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The data point that sort of changed my entire worldview was one that was portrayed in Birthgap, the documentary. It was that 50% of all women who reach age 30 without having had their first baby will go on to be childless by age 45. And the reason why that really rocked my world is because I myself and nearly every woman that I had ever encountered, from my coworkers to my own sisters, my youngest sister being 18, if I had asked them, what is the ideal age for you to have your first baby or start a family, they'd say, 32, 33, 35. And so I started to realize that half of those who wait until that ideal time would be too late for them. And that's when I sort of wanted to grab a flag and go talk to as many people as possible about this data point, because it just, what is portrayed in the film is the sadness that exists on the other side of that statistic. And so I'm curious how, and actually a little extra context is, when I would approach those same women, my sisters, friends, peers, they weren't really moved by the statistic. It didn't really change their point of view. That was my own personal experience, a really small sample size. And those are women who hadn't seen your documentary. So the question I have is how do young people, particularly high school and college age women, react to birth gap? What have you encountered as you're going and speaking with young people about this film?
Yeah, and you're right that one statistic does seem to resonate perhaps more than my other data. If I could, I want to just add in two more words that I used in that statement. I said at most 50%. The likelihood is at most 50%. I knew it would be less than 50%. And the reason I stated it that way is the most accessible data is in 5-year age groups. And I could see for most countries, it's somewhere in the range of 25 to 29. So at most 30. Um, I've actually done that analysis for quite a few countries now, and it will be part of my upcoming paper. It's closer to 25.
Wow.
Um, yeah. So how do people react to this? It's really interesting. And of course, I won't ever know how everyone reacts. Some people like you are quite vocal about it. And I was immediately aware of the surprise that it was generating. But what I've come to discover, and you might, is that some of the people who were either silent in their reaction, nonplussed about it, or were even resistant to it, have now shared with me how shocking it was and how they couldn't even process it versus their current life and their current trajectory. But
Mhm.
yet it had a very big impact on them. I had this in Japan recently where someone who I thought just didn't like the movie, maybe didn't even like me because there's just no reaction and there's some negativity, was fundamentally impacted in a way that I hadn't realized. So maybe people react in different ways. Certainly, I've had the comment, not often, but I get the comment that, well, it's, some people use that as evidence that they themselves don't want kids because they don't care. It's like, well, that's great because everybody else cares and I don't care. So truly, I must be one of those people who does not have the desire for children and never will. I think that's right. I think I'm not an expert in this area, but I get a sense that there's some people who just will never have the desire to have children. I put that no more than 5%. So in some ways, I might have helped those people to confirm what their, you you know,
Right.
decision might be.
I don't know if you've thought about this or researched it, but I have a 41-year-old son. I'm curious about birth rates for boys, for men. If the numbers correlate, like once they reach 40 and they haven't had kids, what are the chances of them having kids? But what I'm experiencing, because he's not having children and I only had one child, is what I call unplanned grandchildlessness. And I'm actually writing a piece right now about my granny clock. Yeah. That's kinda ticking because I know that my son is there's a good chance he's not gonna have kids, and I feel it. As a woman at this age, I feel it in my belly. There's a sadness about it, and that's why Erin is letting me grandmother share grandmother duties with her child. Do you have any data around men, and if they reach a certain age and haven't started families?
Yeah, I do appreciate this question a lot because I know I'm very guilty of talking about women too too much. And just to explain the reason for that is we have such rich data on birth records that allow us to derive all these statistics that relate to women. We just don't have anything like that data for men at all.
Yeah.
So I could go to almost any country in the world, go back decades, break it down to all sorts of categories in terms of how many children a woman had, what age she was when she had children, how those things have shifted. The only thing a man really is from some surveys, but you can certainly infer some things from the data about women. One thing we do know is that men tend to be a little older than women. Somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 years across countries is typical now. So you would therefore say that they reach this point a little bit later than women, and that's certainly true. But we also know that the chances of a man remaining childless for life are higher than for a woman. And why is that? It's more likely for a man who has a child if he or for him to have another relationship in future, perhaps post divorce, for example, and to have another child. So a man is more likely to have had a child with multiple partners, whereas women tend not to do that with the same frequency.
Hmm.
So converse for that is the man who's having a second family is actually taking another man out of the market, as it were.
Mm.
People do say that men have less desire for children. That's not universal. I've seen some men, break down as much as women have over this topic. So I'm not sure that the difference is huge there. My final point is I think, men are living really in a huge blind spot here. Keep getting told and about being proud of the fact that we can have children later in life, but we forget or overlook the fact that we need to find a younger woman to have children with. So the fertility window is really defined by the woman. It doesn't actually really matter the fact that we can technically have a child later in life if there isn't a partner to have one with. And I think we're fooling ourselves in our younger years, imagining that we'll always be, you know, as interesting to women as whatever that level is.
Right.
It only goes one way. So I think we, as men, really have been fooling ourselves about the idea that we can wait.
Yeah. One of the things that you make clear in the film is that you're not trying to persuade or pressure people into having kids, right? So, what would you say to those who do say that they're sure they don't want to have kids? Why should they also care about falling birth rates?
Yeah. These are all great questions. Again, just the opportunity again to repeat how important it is that we respect the decisions of anybody to have a child or not to have a child. I call it pan-natalism. It's my term, meaning I support those who want children and I support those who, for whatever reason, don't. It is a minority. Surveys, for example, I was involved in a large-scale survey in the UK quite recently, 1,500 women aged under 35. For those women in the peak fertility years, early 30s, let's say, 92% either had a child or wanted a child. And that's similar for CDC data I've seen for the US, that somewhere less than 10% of women fall into that category. I wouldn't want to live in a society where people are coerced into having children. That the children just should be thought of as young creatures who are brought into this planet through love, through people who desired them. And the idea that, we might live in coercive societies, I think would backfire heavily on society itself. And I would campaign against that just as strongly as I am campaigning for awareness of the fertility window. Why should they care about falling birth rates? Well, the entire future of society, I think those people are wrongly criticized for not caring about the future of humanity, bearing in mind that, they may at some moment in time have wanted children that might be through circumstances where they've had a divorce, so they don't want children, or other reasons. I think childless people have a big role in society. I know if you look at, for example, or I'm told, if you look at charity workers, they are kind of over-indexed in their presence in charity work in terms of helping humanity in different ways. And of course, people without children will age and will need support in their elderly years and will face some unique challenges that those people often with children don't quite face.
Mm.
Um, I think as society, we need to be mindful of that and make sure that we do put systems in place to take care of people in that category. So I think, I feel a healthy society needs to respect everyone's decision and their role, the role that they can play around that.
I know there's a lot of concern economically what this could mean as we age and there aren't replacement workers. But I came across, as I was doing a little research, an article in the Scientific American saying that population decline is actually good for the planet. They weren't quite on the Paul Ehrlich train, but they were approaching their assumptions at a different level. And they were saying that we have this assumption that population decline will harm the economy. But Deloitte, I think, was the researcher, did did a study that suggested that lower fertility rates would not only result in lower emissions by 2055, but per capita income increase of 10%. Which I thought, well, that's an interesting argument. I know this is a complex area, the economic aspect of falling birth rates, that none of us here are economists and can speak to it at that level. But you're coming in contact with so many people who are thinking about this. What's your opinion about this idea?
Those kind of comments, to be honest, kind of frustrate me I, enormously. I feel people making those comments should be smarter and probably are smarter. And that in some way they are deceiving, perhaps it's their clients, perhaps it's their employers, perhaps themselves. But the idea that we don't need to care about this is foolish in the extreme. So I call that the elevator argument, where we're on a high floor right now and we want to get down a few more floors to stabilize things and increase GDP by 10%. And you're on the 100th floor and you think the 50th floor is about right. So you hit button 50 and you go back down and you walk out and everything's great. It's not like that. This is a tailspin. You don't get to stop at a certain, point down that vortex. You just get sucked down more and more and more. So there's no possibility of sustainability or stability at that point. Now, to be fair, I haven't read those reports and wouldn't want to speak to them directly, but that general comment that we don't need to worry, I've seen a UN document come out and say the same thing. No, we really need to worry about this, because unless someone figures out what it is we need to do to stabilize birth rates, that tailspin's never going to end. And if you don't care about that, you're an extinctionist. You may not be open about saying it, or you've been misled by extinctionists, and they are out there. We absolutely need to be concerned about this just as much as a giant meteor heading our way.
There have been rapid declines in population throughout history. I'm thinking of plagues. Are there any precedents for what we're experiencing now that we can look back to and go, oh, wait a minute, when they had this rapid population decline, we saw their empire fall?
It's the opposite. We can look at historic examples and realize what actually happens, which is the end of civilization. So the Romans were deeply concerned about this. We know that because speeches were made in the Senate, laws were enacted. So, for example, Romans were penalized if they only had one child, and double penalized if they had no children, including taking away retirement rights. And it didn't work. It did nothing for saving the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did not fade away overnight. It faded away over several hundred years. And historians contribute birth rate decline as a significant factor in that. And I think that's been understated. When you do the math and you see what we're going through now, I'm confident this is a primary driver for the end of the Roman Empire. You mentioned populations or birth rates have gone back up through times like plagues and wars. That's right. So what's the difference? Well, after the plague or after the war ends, the societal norms that were in place beforehand come back again. So the societal norm was to get married at 25. Before the war, during the war, birth rates fall because typically the men are at war. If it's a plague, well, that impacts, men and women clearly. Birth rates fall dramatically. After it ends, it's a societal norm to go back to doing what we did before. So we can't equate those. The difference here is that after these economic shocks, the societal norm changed for good. And the societal norm being that it became normal, typical, to have children later and then later and later. So the economic shocks I talked about at the early 70s and the mortgage crisis of 07, 08 that impacted so many countries, rather than the cause, they were the trigger. Because after those crises ended, the societal norm remained to have children later in life. And that's really, either you could say nature's very clever, that, nature just doesn't want us living lives the way we are now. And, we're kind of in this trap, the Birthgap trap, I call it, or not being able to reverse that cycle. But unless we do figure that out, it's good night. Vienna, and good night Tokyo, and good night every other city on the planet. There is no evidence that a society can be sustained if the average age women are becoming mothers stays anything like what it is now.
Mhm.
So are you proposing the only way to shift the birth rate in the positive direction would be for that average age of first birth to come down? Like, do we need
I,
a reset of societal norms?
yes, it is the singular only way. Going back to the 28 countries of data, I've never seen data more clear or more consistent across decades, across eras, I mean, we're talking data for US, for Russia, for Japan, for Taiwan, for Germany, for Italy. And they're all telling the exact same story. As the average age for motherhood increases, the likelihood of ever becoming a mother decreases significantly. And there's no example of, despite all this fertility technology and, career breaks, great maternity pay later in life, it's not making a dent in that curve.
It's really interesting. I mean, doesn't that feels almost like it's cultural more than economic then at a certain point?
Yeah. It also means it's not biological, because you, you would see a similar pattern across different countries by age. You do start to see that around, I would say, 35. You see countries like South Korea and Portugal where the average age of becoming a mother is so late that they're only achieving one child, which it would be easy to state. I think safe to state is because they ran out of time to have a second or third child. So that's where biology kicks in. But before biology is an issue and before economics is an issue, you have this cultural thing. And what would the cultural be? I think there's just an age where people are typically getting married, and finding a partner during that window is much easier because it's in the minds of people around that age group. And as you leave it later than that, it just becomes, I don't know, more random. If you'll find that other person who also left it that little bit later. And of course, it happens for many people. I'm not saying it's even rare. It's quite common. But if you have 30-40% of people who want to have a child after that time, that average, not ever finding someone, or finding someone when it's too late to have a child, well, that explains exactly why we're in this situation.
Mhm.
Yeah. I often talk about college as needing a total rebrand, as just being the mating market, the modern mating market, because that really is the time for young people to meet in person and to align their goals and their values in a way that allows them to achieve the kids that they want to have, 0 or 5 or whatever the case may be. It gets harder and harder, especially the more remote and atomized lives that we live, to meet people once you're in that prime fertility window and years go by, and we're seeing that play out in the data.
Yeah, and that's right. And I don't think we actually consider another core element of that. You meet someone when you're at college, you've got the entire rest of your life to be defined yet, whichever way you want. And meeting a partner, if you've decided that this is the partner for you, you get to do that together.
Right.
You get to decide where to live together. You get to decide what friend groups you're going to make, what vacations where you're going to go on vacation. You craft your lives together. Now, later on, you still have desire to meet that person to kind of craft life together, but there's certain things you're not going to compromise on. You know where you want to go live, and you got a job and a location, so that kind of narrows down right there for a lot of people who they're going to date. You have to meet someone whose friends you like, because it's too late in life to kind of change friend groups in some ways. So by definition, it's a much smaller set of potential people that you might mate with.
Mhm.
And I sadly, I'm divorced for 20 years. I always assumed I would probably meet someone. Did more than once, but it was never for me a situation where I was prepared to compromise my complex, well-defined life for. So I think, again, the idea of technically being able to have a child at, 32 makes a lot of assumptions about finding a partner that you'd want to have a child with at that moment in time.
You're speaking at the core of a problem that we talk about a bit, and that is that it's so random the way we approach dating and finding a partner without really much thought put into how significant it is and how terrible it is if you pick the wrong partner. It has so many far-reaching implications that young people aren't really made aware of, and or at least I wasn't. I got married too young. I didn't pick the right person. I wish sometimes that there was a matchmaker in my world. I wish somebody in my world had said, "Hey, this is really important." So if where do we get that information? And this is a bigger question and a conversation for another time, but it feels like that's an important place to focus some energy, is helping young people meet the right partners and then make the right decisions about who the right partners are for them.
Well, it's, again, it's how long do we have in this podcast? But no, this is a huge topic, and I think really goes to the core of what I'm seeing in the data. It's about pair bonding, as it might be called. It's about finding that special partner and the time window there is to do that. Now, there's two or three other dynamics that are going on here that appear to be universal. First of all, hypergamy, meaning that women tend to want to match up with someone who's at least as experienced or successful or wealthy as they are. And that goes back to time immemorial. And men tend to be the opposite. It's similar or lower. That we may not like that. Some people might want to change that, but you'd be changing, evolutionary psychology in a way that, just won't happen. Now, if you look at colleges in the US today, I think it's something like 62% of current college students are women. And the dropout rate for men is higher than women. Women are now significantly more educated than men. In the past, you might have had some counter to that by women marrying older. So you're marrying someone who is more established, has defined their career, and has gained some wealth that way. But the age gap has actually reduced over the past few decades. So that seems to be something that, is also going against us. And in terms of, point you made is, well, what if you marry the wrong partner? Yeah, that's got to be a driver, a concern to people. What I find myself saying to young people who are not sure, certainly if they're with someone who might not quite be perfect, who they've been with quite a while and long enough to know that things are not terrible, to ask whether a life with children with that person would give you enough meaning to take the risk on being together or not. I'm not encouraging people to dive into relationships, make commitments to have children with someone that's not right for them at all. But I do sense there is this belief that, well, I might find someone better. I'm going to delay this. And you know what? If you can persuade yourself that actually this person is good enough for me to start a family with and give me kids, if you can't, then break up. Break up now. I'm finding a person, because you're wasting time for you and your partner. I guess I'm saying that nothing's ever perfect, and you got to make a decision and probably make it quicker than we do today, to be fair on it.
Yeah. I think that's really wise and good framing. So as we wrap up, we touched earlier on the fact that this conversation about birth rates has grown within the last year, and that we're seeing really major public figures getting at different aspects of the problem, both economically and socially. So I think when Catherine and I speak about this issue, that's optimistic for us. So what are you most optimistic about? And then on the flip side, what's keeping you up at night?
Birth rate decline's keeping me up at night. So I started out by being pessimistic. I thought I'd find evidence that people just didn't care about kids anymore. I couldn't understand why that would be all of a sudden after millennia that humanity decides not to have kids. Didn't make sense, but that's kind of what I was expecting, that something about modern society had changed that. When I realized that that's not the case, that mostly people do want kids and we have a unplanned childlessness problem, that gave me hope that at least,
Mm,
the desire is there.
right.
But I was still pessimistic because, how do you change that? What ended up giving me super optimism that there can be a solution is screening the documentary to young people from age 12 to 24, college screenings, high school screenings, and Japan, US, UK, the engagement from young people, the intensity to want to talk amongst their peers about this. I mean, I've been in events where, actually one at Cambridge after the cancellation, we had a little secretive Q&A session with me instead. It went on for 4.5 hours,
Wow.
30 people.
Wow.
That's not uncommon. It's a topic that young people want to talk about. And I think through that, I think there will be recognition that they probably want to not change priorities necessarily, but resequence their lives. And if they want to resequence their lives, the rest of the society is going to have to figure that out because we need young workers. And if they are not, coming back into the workforce because they just want kind of resequence lives, companies will lose out, economies will lose out, and we'll have to actually figure out a better way to enable that to happen, to enable them to have the children they want to have and still have a stellar career.
Mm,
Something we didn't have time to really get a little bit more into is the really personal aspect of unplanned childlessness.
Yeah.
It's really tragic for a woman to wake up
Yeah.
one day and realize her fertility window is closed and she wanted kids. And I wonder if Gen Z watching millennials go through that experience might help them also realize how important this is to get the timing right. It's hard to watch those women in your film express how painful it is to live the rest of their lives without children, family, or grandchildren.
Yeah, and they universally describe it as grief. It's
Yeah.
grieving something you never had, which in some ways can be worse because you don't exactly know what it is you're grieving. You never really got to hold that child to be able to. You can't have a photograph of them, and I don't want to kind of. It wouldn't be right to contrast and compare, but I can tell you the depth of grief that you sense. And I think the reason these women and actually men too opened up while I was filming was I don't think they talked to anybody before. This was the first time because it's something we don't talk about. People they assume it's private. Probably they didn't want children. You don't
mhm.
actually realize that the majority of these people, many craved a family and how difficult it is for them to hear work colleagues talking about what they did on weekends with their kids. Not that they begrudge other people having kids, but when you realize the hurt that causes. And I think you're right. I think the documentary, I didn't know this when I was setting out to make it, but I think the power of those stories and younger people seeing that potential outcome, I think can have an effect here.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your documentary, for opening this conversation up in our culture, and for helping Aaron and I meet each other, and we're getting busy in our own way with a nonprofit. That's our baby, my grandchild, so to speak.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think you really are part of our creation story. So thank you so much for all your good energy and hard work and for surviving. I'm sure all of the stuff that you've had to go through in terms of the pushback on this. Just thank you for being strong and pushing through and getting this message out there.
Well, hearing this just adds to my own inspiration and belief that we can make a difference. So thank you for, you know, following through on, perhaps many people have ideas to create nonprofits or to kind of contribute. And it's so heartwarming to hear your story. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Well, we will be following along. Can't wait for what you do next, Stephen. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank